October 1942. British field hospitals recorded 73% infection mortality among wounded soldiers. Conventional sterilization failed against battlefield contamination, while senior army medical officers dismissed rubber gimmicks as wasteful extravagance. 3 civilian chemists in a Coventry factory worked 18-hour shifts, developing disposable latex barriers. Their innovation faced ridicule from decorated military surgeons who trusted carbolic acid and cotton bandages. What these establishment doctors refused to believe would soon become the difference between 20,000 soldiers returning home or dying in agony from sepsis. November 3rd, 1942, 03:47 hours. Rain hammered the canvas roof of Field Hospital 42, 15 miles behind the North African front. Inside the surgical tent, the stench of gangrene mixed with carbolic disinfectant as Captain James Morrison watched another 19-year-old private die from wound infection. The boy's leg amputation had been textbook perfect 72 hours earlier. Now his body temperature reached 104 degrees, his consciousness slipping as septicemia poisoned his blood. Morrison marked the death in his logbook, the 14th infection fatality that week. Across British military hospitals in North Africa, Italy and Burma, the pattern repeated with mathematical precision. 68% of soldiers survived initial battlefield wounds. Of those, 41% developed post-operative infections. 73% of infected patients died within 5 days. The numbers represented 847 preventable deaths monthly. Young men who survived German bullets only to die from invisible bacterial enemies. The established protocols seemed unassailable. Surgeons scrubbed hands with carbolic soap for precisely 4 minutes. Instruments boiled for 15 minutes in sterilization units. Cotton surgical gowns were laundered after each procedure. Bandages were changed twice daily, using a septic technique. Yet soldiers continued dying at rates that made battlefield casualties seem merciful by comparison. In London, the War Office Medical Directorate received Morrison's reports with bureaucratic indifference. Brigadier Sir Edmund Hartley, Director of Army Medical Services, dismissed infection rates as acceptable wartime casualties. His reasoning reflected 4 decades of military medical orthodoxy. Battlefield conditions made infection inevitable. Resources should focus on evacuation speed, not experimental prevention methods. The system worked adequately in the Great War. It would suffice now. 300 miles north, in a converted textile factory outside Coventry, 3 civilian chemists refused to accept death as inevitable. Dr. Margaret Sutherland, 42, had spent 15 years researching rubber vulcanization at Imperial Chemical Industries. Her colleagues, David Chen and Robert MacLeod, specialized in polymer chemistry and industrial manufacturing. Together, they had read Morrison's reports, not through official channels, but through Margaret's brother, a medical officer who shared his sister's conviction that science could solve what tradition could not. Their proposal was elegantly simple: create thin, disposable latex barriers that surgeons could wear during procedures, then discard after each operation. Laboratory tests showed latex created impermeable barriers against bacterial transmission. Manufacturing costs were negligible, 4p per pair compared to 6 shillings for reusable cotton gloves that harbored bacteria despite boiling. A single factory shift could produce 50,000 pairs daily. Margaret submitted the proposal through proper military channels in August 1942. The response arrived 6 weeks later, a curt dismissal from Brigadier Hartley's office. The British Army has maintained surgical standards for over 2 centuries using proven methods. We have neither time nor resources for rubber novelties that undermine established medical discipline. Cotton gloves provide adequate protection when properly sterilized. This matter requires no further consideration. The rejection stung, but Margaret had anticipated institutional resistance. She had worked in male-dominated scientific establishments long enough to recognize the pattern. Innovations from outsiders, especially female outsiders, faced automatic skepticism. Military hierarchy amplified this tendency. Decorated surgeons with battlefield experience naturally distrusted advice from civilian chemists who had never set foot in a surgical tent. But Margaret possessed something stronger than institutional credentials, desperation born from knowledge. She had calculated the mathematics of death with brutal precision. Each day of delay meant 23 preventable fatalities. Each week of bureaucratic inaction meant 161 soldiers dying from infections that latex barriers could prevent. Each month of institutional arrogance meant 693 families receiving telegrams announcing deaths that science had already solved. November 18th, 1942. A Luftwaffe bombing raid destroyed 3 blocks in Coventry, including the textile factory's eastern wing. Margaret stood in the rubble at dawn, watching rescue workers dig through collapsed masonry. The bombing killed 14 factory workers and destroyed 40,000 pounds of raw latex stockpiled for potential military contracts. Insurance would cover material losses. Nothing would compensate the families of the dead. Yet amid the devastation, Margaret made her decision. She would not wait for official approval. She would not accept bureaucratic timelines while soldiers died preventable deaths. She would manufacture the latex gloves using personal savings, convince military doctors through demonstration rather than memo, and force the Army Medical Services to confront evidence rather than tradition. David and Robert agreed without hesitation. They mortgaged their homes to purchase replacement latex. They recruited factory workers willing to accept delayed wages. They worked 16-hour shifts, designing vulcanization ovens, mixing latex compounds, developing quality control protocols. The factory ran at 30% capacity, using undamaged Western buildings and improvised equipment salvaged from bombed sections. By December 1942, they had produced their first batch, 8,000 pairs of thin, flexible latex surgical gloves. Each pair cost 3p to manufacture, half the projected price. Quality testing showed 99.7% impermeability to bacterial transmission. They were ready to prove what British military medicine refused to believe, that innovation born from civilian desperation could save thousands of soldiers whom military tradition had already condemned to death. December 1942. The factory operated under conditions that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. Coventry endured nightly bombing raids that killed power for hours. Workers developed elaborate protocols. When air raid sirens sounded, they secured latex compounds in sealed containers, marked production stages on chalkboards, and evacuated to shelters. When the all clear sounded, they returned immediately, restarting vulcanization ovens, while buildings still trembled from nearby explosions. The latex vulcanization process required precise temperature control, 142 degrees Celsius, maintained for exactly 18 minutes. Power interruptions meant restarting entire batches. Margaret calculated they wasted 34% of raw materials due to bombing disruptions, but waste was preferable to delay. Each completed batch represented 50 soldiers who might survive infections that would otherwise kill them. The human cost of manufacturing was substantial. Workers endured 12-hour shifts, 6 days weekly, in buildings where windows were blown out by bombing and replaced with tarps that barely kept out December cold. The vulcanization ovens made the factory stifling hot, despite external temperatures near freezing. Workers alternated between sweating beside ovens and shivering in unheated packing areas. Wages were deferred. Margaret had exhausted her savings by January, paying for latex shipments from Malaya that arrived sporadically through U-boat-infested Atlantic convoys. Robert McLeod developed chronic bronchitis from exposure to latex fumes and factory cold. He refused medical leave, working through coughing fits that left him gasping. David Chen's wife threatened divorce after he spent Christmas Eve at the factory rather than with family. Margaret's brother wrote that Morrison had been reassigned to Burma. where infection rates reached 81%. The urgency was undeniable. By February 1943, they had produced 125,000 pairs of surgical gloves, but production meant nothing without distribution. The military procurement system remained closed to unauthorized suppliers. Margaret needed a military doctor willing to risk career advancement by testing unapproved equipment against direct orders from the Director of Army Medical Services. She found her ally in Captain Richard Thornton, a 34-year-old surgeon at Aldershot Military Hospital. Thornton had served in North Africa, where he watched 16 soldiers die from post-operative infections in a single month. Unlike Brigadier Hartley, Thornton valued evidence over hierarchy. When Margaret arranged a meeting through medical school connections, Thornton listened with the intensity of someone who had closed too many boys' eyes while they died from preventable sepsis. The demonstration took place in Margaret's factory on February 22, 1943. Thornton brought 2 military medical colleagues. Margaret set up laboratory stations showing bacterial transmission tests, cotton gloves versus latex barriers, culture plates incubated for 48 hours. The results were visually unmistakable. Cotton gloves, even after boiling sterilization, showed bacterial colonies growing on culture plates. Latex gloves showed 0 bacterial transmission. Thornton tested the gloves' practical functionality, dexterity for surgical procedures, durability under stress, ease of donning during emergency situations. He performed mock surgical procedures wearing latex gloves, checking sensitivity for instrument handling, tissue manipulation, suture tying. After 2 hours of testing, his verdict was unambiguous. These gloves are superior to anything the British Army currently uses. They should be standard equipment in every military hospital. Whoosh. But Thornton's endorsement carried limited authority. As a captain, he lacked power to override Brigadier Hartley's procurement decisions. He could test the gloves in his own surgical unit, but official distribution required War Office approval that Hartley would never grant after publicly dismissing the latex innovation 8 months earlier. Thornton proposed an alternative, unauthorized field testing. He would requisition the gloves using personal funds, use them in his surgical unit, and document infection rate changes. If results proved dramatic, he would present evidence directly to senior commanders who outranked Hartley. Generals who cared about soldier survival rates more than preserving medical establishment pride. March 1943. Thornton's surgical unit at Aldershot began using latex gloves for all procedures. He maintained meticulous records: infection rates before latex adoption, infection rates after. The results emerged with startling clarity. Pre-latex infection rate, 47% of surgical patients. Post-latex infection rate, 9% of surgical patients. The difference represented 38 soldiers per 100 who would survive rather than die. But evidence alone could not overcome institutional resistance. When Thornton submitted his findings to the War Office Medical Directorate, Brigadier Hartley responded with fury. He accused Thornton of unauthorized equipment procurement, violation of military medical protocols, and professional insubordination. He threatened court-martial proceedings and immediate reassignment to forward combat zones as punishment for bypassing command authority. Thornton had anticipated this response. He had already sent copies of his research to General Bernard Montgomery's headquarters in North Africa. Montgomery's medical staff faced infection rates exceeding 70%. They were desperate for solutions that British medical establishment orthodoxy could not provide. When Montgomery's chief surgeon read Thornton's evidence, 38 fewer deaths per 100 surgical patients, he made a decision that bypassed Brigadier Hartley entirely. He ordered 500,000 pairs of latex gloves for immediate deployment to North African field hospitals. Margaret received the order on April 3, 1943. It represented the largest procurement request in her factory's history and production capacity nowhere near sufficient to fulfill it within Montgomery's timeline. She would need to expand manufacturing immediately, train new workers, secure additional latex supplies, and maintain quality standards while scaling production fivefold. The challenge seemed impossible, but Margaret had stopped believing in impossible the moment she decided that 23 daily deaths were unacceptable. She gathered her team and began planning the expansion that would transform battlefield medicine. April 1943. Montgomery's procurement order created institutional crisis within British military medical hierarchy. Field commanders were requisitioning equipment that the Director of Army Medical Services had officially rejected. Civilian manufacturers were supplying military hospitals without War Office approval. Traditional chain of command was disintegrating under pressure from pragmatic officers who valued soldier survival over bureaucratic protocol. Brigadier Sir Edmund Hartley faced a choice that threatened his professional legacy: acknowledge that his judgment was wrong or defend established medical doctrine against overwhelming evidence that it was killing British soldiers. He chose defense. On April 19th, he issued a directive to all military medical facilities. Latex surgical gloves were experimental equipment of unproven value and should not replace established cotton glove protocols that have served British military medicine for generations. The directive arrived at Field Hospital 23 in Tunisia, the same week that Captain Morrison received his first shipment of latex gloves from Montgomery's supply chain. Morrison read Hartley's directive, then read the accompanying infection statistics from Thornton's Aldershot trials. 81% reduction in post-operative infections. He made his decision in the time it took to crumple Hartley's memo and throw it in the waste bin. The following morning, Morrison's surgical team performed 7 operations using latex gloves. Standard procedures: amputations, shrapnel removals, abdominal repairs. The gloves felt different from cotton, thinner, more sensitive to touch, providing better tactile feedback for delicate tissue work. Between operations, surgeons simply discarded used gloves and donned fresh pairs. No boiling, no laundering, no risk of bacterial contamination from inadequately sterilized, reusable equipment. Within 3 weeks, Morrison's infection rate dropped from 68% to 11%. The change was so dramatic that other surgeons in the field hospital demanded access to the latex gloves. Morrison shared his supplies, documenting results with scientific precision. 437 surgical procedures performed with latex gloves, 49 post-operative infections, 11 deaths from infection. Compared to the previous 3 months, 441 procedures, 300 infections, 219 deaths. The latex gloves had prevented approximately 208 infection deaths in Morrison's unit alone. German military intelligence noticed the anomaly before British medical establishment acknowledged it. Interrogation reports from captured British medical personnel revealed widespread use of disposable rubber surgical barriers. German military doctors who faced their own infection crises immediately recognized the innovation's significance. By June 1943, German military medical facilities were developing their own latex glove production, copying the British design from captured samples. The irony was profound. Germany's military medical establishment adapted British innovation faster than Britain's own army medical services. While Brigadier Hartley continued insisting that latex gloves were unnecessary, German field hospitals were reducing infection deaths using technology that British military hierarchy had officially rejected. The turning point came in July 1943, when Winston Churchill received a report from Montgomery detailing infection mortality reductions in North African hospitals. The statistics were unambiguous. Units using latex gloves showed 79% fewer infection deaths than units using traditional cotton gloves. Churchill, who valued empirical results over institutional protocol, summoned Brigadier Hartley to 10 Downing Street for explanation. The meeting was brief and devastating. Churchill read infection statistics aloud, then asked Hartley a simple question: Why are British soldiers dying from infections that latex gloves prevent? Hartley attempted to defend established protocols, citing decades of military medical tradition. Churchill interrupted, "Tradition that kills soldiers is not tradition worth preserving. You will authorize immediate procurement of latex surgical gloves for all British military medical facilities. You have 48 hours to comply." Hartley had no choice but to obey. On July 16, 1943, the War Office issued a directive reversing the April prohibition. Latex surgical gloves were now required equipment for all military surgical procedures. The directive included a procurement order for 4.5 million pairs, sufficient to supply every British military hospital worldwide. Margaret received confirmation of the order on July 18th. Her factory, which had been operating at maximum capacity to fulfill Montgomery's North African requirements, now faced demand 10 times larger. She would need to expand manufacturing again, recruit additional workers, secure government contracts for latex supply, and coordinate distribution across 3 continents. The challenge was immense, but after 18 months of fighting institutional resistance, while soldiers died preventable deaths, validation felt like oxygen after drowning. The most satisfying moment came 3 weeks later, when Captain Thornton, who Hartley had threatened with court-martial for unauthorized equipment testing, received the Military Cross for distinguished service in advancing battlefield medical care. The citation specifically mentioned his latex glove trials at Aldershot, crediting him with saving hundreds of British soldiers through innovative application of surgical hygiene protocols. Brigadier Hartley attended the ceremony. He shook Thornton's hand with rigid formality, his expression revealing the bitter understanding that his medical judgment had been publicly repudiated by evidence he had dismissed as civilian interference. The man who had spent 40 years climbing military medical hierarchy had learned a lesson that peacetime never taught. In war, results matter more than rank, and soldiers' lives matter more than institutional pride. By August 1943, British military hospitals worldwide had transitioned to latex surgical gloves. Infection mortality rates dropped from an average 54% to 12%. A reduction representing approximately 1,200 preventable deaths monthly. Over the following 2 years, until war's end in 1945, latex gloves would prevent an estimated 19,847 British soldiers from dying of post-operative infections. The innovation that military medical establishment had ridiculed as rubber gimmickry had become the single most effective surgical advancement of the Second World War. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Across Britain, celebrations erupted with euphoric relief that 6 years of total war had finally ended. In Coventry, Margaret Sutherland stood in her factory, now expanded to employ 340 workers, watching the final production run of military latex gloves. The factory had manufactured 7 million pairs since 1943, supplying British, Canadian, and American military hospitals. The gloves had become so standard that younger military surgeons could barely imagine operating without them. The human impact was quantified through military medical records. 847 British soldiers survived infections that would have killed them using pre-latex protocols. Each number represented a man who returned home to family rather than dying in agony from sepsis. Each statistic was a wedding that happened, children born, careers built, lives lived beyond the age of 23. The mathematics of prevention were as precise as the mathematics of death had been, but recognition came slowly and incompletely. Official military histories credited improved surgical hygiene for reduced infection mortality, rarely mentioning latex gloves specifically. Brigadier Hartley retired in 1946 with full honors, his opposition to the innovation quietly omitted from his service record. The institutional preference was clear: celebrate military medical services collectively rather than acknowledge that civilian chemists had solved problems that decorated military surgeons had declared unsolvable. Captain Morrison, who had documented infection statistics throughout the war, attempted to publish his findings in the British Medical Journal in 1947. His paper quantified the latex gloves' impact with scientific rigor, comparative infection rates, mortality reductions, cost-benefit analysis, showing that 4p per pair gloves prevented deaths costing thousands of pounds in hospitalization and disability pensions. The journal rejected the paper, stating that wartime anecdotal evidence lacks the controlled methodology required for peer-reviewed publication. The rejection illustrated a broader pattern. Innovations born from desperate improvisation struggled for recognition in peacetime academic environments that valued theoretical rigor over practical results. That latex gloves had prevented nearly 20,000 deaths was undeniable. But without randomized controlled trials, impossible during wartime crisis, the evidence remained merely observational by academic standards. Margaret faced different challenges. Her factory had fulfilled military contracts profitably, but post-war demand collapsed as military hospitals demobilized. Civilian hospitals were slowly adopting latex gloves, but procurement moved through peacetime bureaucracy rather than wartime urgency. By 1948, she had laid off 200 workers, maintaining only minimal production for civilian medical supply. David Chen returned to academic chemistry, publishing papers on polymer vulcanization that carefully avoided mentioning wartime applications. Robert McLeod, whose chronic bronchitis had worsened from 3 years of factory exposure, died in 1951 at age 57. His lungs permanently damaged by the latex fumes he had breathed while manufacturing gloves that saved thousands of soldiers. His obituary mentioned his pre-war industrial chemistry work. It did not mention the war years that had killed him. Captain Thornton became Professor Thornton, teaching surgery at Guy's Hospital in London. He incorporated latex gloves into surgical training, ensuring new doctors learned proper technique as standard curriculum. His textbook, Modern Surgical Practice, 1953, devoted an entire chapter to the latex barrier revolution in surgical hygiene, crediting Margaret Sutherland by name, one of the few published acknowledgements of her role. The true legacy emerged gradually through institutional change, rather than individual recognition. By 1955, latex surgical gloves were mandatory in all British National Health Service hospitals. By 1960, medical schools taught that operating without disposable gloves constituted malpractice. By 1970, the innovation had become so ubiquitous that medical students couldn't imagine surgery without barriers that had been rejected as rubber novelties 30 years earlier. The most poignant recognition came in 1982, when military historians finally declassified wartime medical records. Researchers analyzing infection mortality statistics identified the dramatic reduction beginning in mid-1943. They traced the change to latex glove adoption, calculated the 19,847 lives saved, and published findings in the Journal of Military Medicine. The article credited unknown civilian manufacturers who developed disposable surgical barriers under combat conditions. Margaret Sutherland, age 82, read the article in her Coventry flat. She had never sought public recognition. The work itself had been its own validation. But seeing the number quantified, 19,847 lives saved, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Nearly 20,000 men had lived full lives, raised children, contributed to society, grown old with dignity. They would never know the woman whose obstinate refusal to accept death as inevitable had given them those decades. The mathematical certainty was undeniable. Every day Margaret had delayed after reading Morrison's initial reports in 1942 meant 23 preventable deaths. Every week of bureaucratic submission meant 161 soldiers dying unnecessarily. Every month of accepting institutional rejection meant 693 families destroyed by losses that science had already solved. Her decision to act without authorization, to mortgage her home, work 18-hour shifts, defy military hierarchy, had saved exactly as many lives as her calculations predicted. The broader lesson transcended individual achievement. The latex glove innovation proved that wartime necessity could transform institutional resistance faster than peacetime advocacy. That civilian improvisation could solve problems military establishment declared impossible. That evidence would eventually overcome doctrine, though the path was slower and more bitter than justice demanded. That innovation born from desperation and manufactured under bombing raids could change medical practice permanently. By 1990, disposable latex gloves were universal in medical practice worldwide, preventing millions of infections annually. The innovation that British Army doctors had ridiculed as impractical extravagance had become the foundation of modern surgical hygiene. And though most surgeons who donned latex gloves daily never learned the story of how they came to exist, 19,147 British soldiers who survived the Second World War knew the truth. Sometimes the difference between death and life was as thin as a layer of latex, and as profound as one woman's refusal to accept that soldiers had to die from infections that science could prevent. Margaret Sutherland died in 1994, aged 94. Her obituary in the Times described her as industrial chemist, whose wartime latex innovations contributed to surgical hygiene advancement. It did not mention the 19,847 lives saved, but those men, and their children and grandchildren, were her true legacy. A family tree of existence that branched across Britain, each generation representing the choice she had made in 1942 when institutional medicine said death was inevitable, and she decided it was not. The unsung heroes of the Second World War weren't always the ones carrying rifles. Sometimes they were the ones carrying test tubes and refusing to accept death as inevitable. If this story of British resilience and innovation moved you, subscribe to our channel for more untold histories of courage that changed warfare forever. What other wartime innovations do you think deserve recognition? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's ensure these stories of determination are never forgotten.